Jingle All the Way 2 is simply your average dime a dozen bad Christmas movie. The original, however, is much more interesting, because while opinions on it tend to vary wildly, with many viewing it as just another bad and mean-spirited Christmas film, while others find it a funny and refreshing guilty pleasure, and as I explained in another video, which you can find the link in the description to, movies like that do have appeal, especially with those who might find conventional Christmas movies too saccharine. Very few will argue that the film is very well written. However, while most definitely by no means a masterpiece, when one actually looks at the movie a little closer, it's actually a bit more clever than most would give it credit for, and that's what the sequel in turn lacks. And today, I'd like to go over Jingle All the Way, and specifically why it's a more accurate satire of Christmas than most would be willing to admit. And there will be spoilers ahead, so in case you haven't seen this movie yet but plan to, you might want to come back to this video another day. This will be the only spoiler warning I'll be giving out. Okay, so as I explained in my video on why most parody movies don't work, which you can find a link in the description to, usually movies that focus themselves around satire aren't very smart and only make very cheap and obvious jokes at what they're trying to make fun of, and the results are usually anywhere from unfunny to downright unwatchable. And while some will most definitely argue that Jingle All the Way suffers from these problems, in actuality it's a bit more complicated than that. Because while the movie is first and foremost a parody of Christmas shopping, and the lengths certain parents will go to get certain toys for their kids, there's also a lot more to it. Because simply put, in many ways Jingle All the Way is a parody of not only conventional Christmas movies, but also what the holiday has really become over time. Think about it. In most typical Christmas movies, a loving but stressed family at first goes to ridiculous extremes to get something that either they or a loved one wants for Christmas. But after realizing they're getting way too caught up in commercialism, they end up learning the true meaning of Christmas and apologizing. Since spending time with family, enjoying the good things in life, and giving to others is what the holiday is supposed to be about. Now obviously there are many different variations on this format, but at its core that's what most Christmas movies are about, especially when it comes to commercialization, with A Charlie Brown Christmas probably being one of the best examples, as I went into further detail on in another video, which you can also find a link in the description too. And what Jingle All the Way does is take all of the sentiment and goodwill that Christmas is supposed to evoke and throws it right out the window and essentially says, yeah, that's all well and good, but this is how the world really works. And as a result, the setup is the same, but the execution is totally different. Because you've got the family with the stressed out husband who wants to prove his love by getting his son the coveted Turbo Man action figure, as his wife and son resent that he barely has any time for them, and feels that this is the perfect way to redeem himself in their eyes. But rather than this culminating in all of them learning what Christmas is really all about, instead his attempts to get the toy only makes things worse and worse, and he only redeems himself when he embraces commercialism to the highest degree by literally becoming Turbo Man in a parade and saving his son exactly the way the character did on the show. In other words, the movie is showing how people in modern times really do only care about commercialism that Christmas has become drenched in, with Howard's success and failures regarding Turbo Man being directly tied to how his family sees him. Because even if they don't know about his struggles, as he fails to get the action figure, he falls lower and lower in their esteem, and once he becomes Turbo Man, that's when they finally end up proud and appreciate him. Now, one of the chief complaints lobbied against the film is that pretty much all of the characters come across as unsympathetic even when they aren't supposed to. But the thing is, that's part of the point. As I noted before, the movie is satirizing the typical Christmas movie formula by putting everybody in the worst light possible. And the saddest part of all is that it's not too different from real life either. Obviously there is some exaggeration, but the way the family resents Howard until he brings up commercialism, his and Myron going way too far in trying to get a Turbo Man action figure because they believe it's the only way to be seen as a good father in the eyes of their family, which is a fear that's not unfounded, mind you. The employee's very cynical attitude due to having to bear the brunt of too many customers' anger for things that weren't their fault, and Howard's accidental redemption through embracing Turbo Man to the extreme are all things that do have a surprising basis in reality, and the fact that the characters have a hard time getting sympathy from the viewer is a natural consequence of that. Because as I just said, in many ways this movie is showing exactly what Christmas has become, and how it feels a lot more like give me rather than give-ing. But what's often lost on viewers is that the unsympathetic nature of the characters is actually a joke at their expense. Because it's basically saying, yeah, you see all these jerks that only care about themselves and material gain? That's you! And like I said before, while it is exaggerated due to this being a satire, for a lot of people it's unfortunately not too far off. Many really do get so caught up in the commercialization of Christmas and what they can get from it that they totally forget what it's really all about. Now, the movie does try to subtly remind the viewer of what the holiday is meant to be through the characters' more redeeming moments, particularly in how Howard decides not to go through with stealing another kid's toy because he realizes how wrong that would be, even though not doing it only makes things a million times worse for him, as well as a subsequent drunken talk with the reindeer about how the only thing that's important to him now is finding a way to redeem himself in the eyes of his family. Because, once again, as a parody of the Christmas rush and people getting too caught up in commercialization, it naturally wants to find some way to show the audience that Christmas is about more than that. But in spite of these few moments, in the end it ultimately commits hard to the satire by ending the way I described before, with Howard's redemption coming from commercialization rather than the loving reunion and apology that he was probably planning on. Now, one could argue that this more deep-rooted satire I'm describing was unintentional on the writer's part, and that the idea only went as far as being a parody of Christmas Shopping starring Arnold Schwarzenegger, and that the characters coming across as unsympathetic and mean-spirited was an unintended consequence. But whether or not that is indeed the case, the fact still remains that the movie still works very effectively as a satire of the commercialization of a wholesome holiday taken way too far, and how it turns everybody into jerks only concerned with material gain, while forgetting why they celebrate Christmas in the first place as a result. And when viewed through that lens, that does indeed make the film appear more geniusly written than it was probably intended, to the point that it arguably becomes a movie people need to see in order to give them a reality check in regards to how they look at certain holidays, and especially Christmas. Again, on its own the results aren't great and guilty pleasure worthy at most, but when the character's lack of sympathy is viewed as intentional, it suddenly becomes a lot better and more eye-opening. The only question is whether or not it was meant to be that way by the writers, or if these deeper layers were completely accidental. Though there is one other thing this movie parodies in a surprisingly interesting way, and was most definitely intentional on top of that. Specifically the running gag that everybody hates Booster, Turbo Man's comical animal sidekick. Because while at first glance it might appear to be nothing more than a joke, there's actually a lot more to it than that, as Booster is meant to be a parody of how shows and cartoons geared at slightly older children will often have it mandated by the studio executives that a character that appeals to smaller kids be added to the mix in order to increase its appeal, even when said character would be completely out of place. And as a result, said character usually ends up being shoehorned in and doesn't gel well with the intended tone, which in turn makes them hated because the audience just finds them annoying and taking time away from what they'd rather be watching. And Booster honestly fills this role to a T, as from the episode shown at the beginning of the movie, The tone is clearly meant to be one of action and superheroes, with every character fitting into that setting. All except for the weird pink animal thing that stumbles around and hardly manages to accomplish anything, and not to mention barely interacts with the man he's supposed to be the sidekick of, since they have very different personalities. Simply put, it's plainly obvious, even to a little kid, that if Turbo Man were to really exist, he'd never have somebody so incompetent as his assistant. In other words, Booster doesn't fit into the action of the show, is the polar opposite of the man he's supposed to be best friends with, and is even visually out of place, all of which plainly show that the writers only included him because they were forced to. And on top of that, notice how every time the kid mentions Turbo Man, he always immediately follows it up with Booster, as if he's just as cool as the man himself. To put it simply, Booster is clearly only there because the executives wanted to use him for merchandising. Only because he's completely out of place, everybody sees right through the show's attempts to make him artificially cool and just find him annoying, to the point that he becomes hated and the show's only sore spot rather than the most popular and marketable thing about it. And what makes Booster especially interesting is that his depiction here is right on the money, with there being countless examples of shows out there that have a character that feels distinctly out of place with the rest of it and is often not very well liked as a result. Now, as for the show not really looking all that impressive, or like something that would become such a huge phenomenon, that could very well have been intentional too, in order to satirize some of the stuff that audiences will eat up, regardless of the obvious lack of quality. But unlike Booster, it's hard to say for certain. After all, most of the budget probably went to the climax, and that's not even getting into the sort of funding such a show would realistically get. So in the end, the one thing that can be said for certain about Jingle All the Way is that it's a satire, but how much of it was intentional is a matter of debate. Because on the one hand, there are things like Booster, which is actually a very clever takedown of how meddling executives can cause damage to a perfect show, while on the other there's the character's behavior and just how much of it is accidental versus an intelligent riff on what getting too caught up in commercialism does to people. Though, as I argued before, it honestly doesn't matter if the unsympathetic nature of the characters was done on purpose, as it ends up saying something pretty important regardless of whether the writers meant to say it or not. Because, as I already said, unlike a typical wholesome Christmas movie where the family realizes that materialism isn't important and learn the true meaning of Christmas, Jingle All the Way arguably tells it like it is and shows how people have become so obsessed with commercialism that the only way for Howard to get out of the mess he caused is to embrace it full throttle, rather than the characters learning any sort of lesson that their indulgence in too much commercialism is the real problem. And as I pointed out before, the lack of such an epiphany is a very real one for many people. So while it may not be the most well-regarded Christmas film out there by any means, Jingle All the Way may just be among the most real in many ways, even if most of what it had to say was probably unintentional. Okay, that's everything I wanted to cover. So now I'd like to hear your thoughts on this. Do you believe that Jingle All the Way is a much smarter and more important satire on the extreme commercialization of Christmas and everybody's obsession with materialism than it's usually given credit for? Or do you think it's simply a bad and mean-spirited film and that anything intelligent it had to say was most definitely unintentional? Or would you take it even a step further and say that it has nothing to say at all and that I was reading into things that aren't even there? Please let me know in the comments, because you don't have to agree with anything I said here if you don't want to. You can feel about Jingle All the Way or anything else we discuss here, and if you think I couldn't have been any more backwards, that is totally okay. And thank you all for watching. I really appreciate it, and I hope to see you all next time.